Now, if you're unfamiliar with Christianity, the Bible, Jesus, and you're looking for some sort of gateway in, I believe that this reading here is a perfect gateway into Christianity or the message of Jesus. So we'll drop right in. There's a scribe who approaches Jesus and asks a very fantastic question to try to boil down the essence of what Christianity is. He asks Jesus, "What is the first of all the commandments?" I love this because if you're unfamiliar with Christianity, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, if you're unfamiliar with Jesus, any of this, you can ask this question, which is essentially, how do I boil down all of Christianity into just the essence? It's a big religious system. How do I ignore a lot of it? I know that's the Old Testament, the New Testament, all this. The church is complicated. This question that the scribe asks Jesus, what is the first of all the commandments? It's an attempt to boil down what is the true essence of Christianity. Furthermore, you can look at it a little differently. Rather than boiling everything down to just what do I need to focus on, you can actually do the opposite, which is how do I kind of go up to the top of the ladder and go, what's the holding or the portfolio of the entire doctrine and doctrines of Christianity and what Jesus is all about? How about I just go right to the top and follow that one and let everything trickle down? That's essentially what this question is getting at. What is the first of all the commandments? This question's great because it's a way to get right to the heart of Jesus. And this scribe gets to ask Jesus this, and that's exactly what this reading shows us, okay? Now, if you're a secular person, irreligious, or even a religious person, I want us to take note of this because we're going to boil down the gateway or the essence into Jesus, into Christianity, into the Bible. But notice this. The question isn't, what's the essence of Christianity or, what's the gateway of, understanding the Bible, or how do I boil down everything of what Jesus is teaching into one thing? It's what's the first of all the commandments? The basic assumption that the scribe has, and maybe you have, is that Christianity is about commandments. The basic presupposition is that in order to understand Jesus, Christianity, the gospel, you need to understand commandments. Now think about this for a second. Let's assume that that's the case, okay? We have to because the scribe does, commandments. Usually, and I really want you to think about which kind of camp you're in here. Usually when we, appropriate ourselves to certain commandments, we can take the first camp, which is to keep them. What are the commandments? So that I might keep them. What are the things I may do or don't do, right? And so I want us to think a little bit more elegantly here. It's not so much what are the do's and don'ts of the Bible, but more so, what is your moral code, or should I say your moral spectrum of what's right and wrong? It's really the ethical system of do's and don'ts that everybody has. They navigate life through the prism of commandments. And so you can think of this as a spectrum, right? You might be on the spectrum that says, if anybody disagrees with the idea that immigrants can come into our country, then they are, evil or something. Or, if anybody disagrees with the idea that a woman must have the right to choose, then, they're evil because there's a life and human potential, et cetera, These things come to mind during this week, especially election week. It's sort of these commandments we have to live by, this moral system. Everybody has their own. And so the scribe is asking, well, what's yours, Jesus? How do I boil it all down? Now, another way to approach commandments is to abolish them, okay? Now, I see this less and less, to be honest with you. I think our society's become much more religious in that we hold people to a moral standard now, with almost no room for redemption or forgiveness if they break it, okay? So this is less often that I see this. However, I still see this. We can just sort of ignore the laws and ignore moral codes and stuff like this, and maybe even take a more, elegant approach, which is to say, well, it's not that objective truth and objective laws exist. It's more so that subjective laws and, we have our own systems and there's no real way to get objective about it. I think the thing that's even more common, though, is we can actually take an approach of dismantling any sort of ideas of laws. So this looks like dismantling corrupt or unjust systems within maybe our legal system or in our work or society, etc. However, with this idea of commandments, right, whether you keep them, the do's and don'ts, that sort of approach, or you take the approach of, I'm going to abolish all of it, right, or ignore them, what does it fundamentally get down to? It's the basic assumption that the commandments have to keep in mind with what do we do about them? It boils down to, what do I need to do? Okay? However, and this is why I love this reading for our text this morning, is the biblical gospel. In other words, the doctrine of how to be made right with God and boil down the essence of what the message of Jesus is not what do we do, but it's one of love. Biblical gospel is love. So let's look at the text, okay? In the Old Testament reading, we have this, Deuteronomy 6, 2-6. It says this, "Fear the Lord your God, and keep throughout the days of all your lives all his statutes and commandments, which I enjoin on you, and thus have a long life. Hear then, Israel, be careful to observe them, that you may grow and prosper the more." Okay, what does that sound like? It sounds like duty. It sounds like commandments. What it sounds like is, I've just laid out a bunch of laws for you. Be careful to do them. Okay, now what is that? That's keep these laws, okay? Don't abolish them, keep them, and then you'll have a happy life, okay? Duty and commandments. Keep them, is that what we should do? Or should we ignore that burden and just abolish it? It's the same thing, okay? But what did I just say? The biblical gospel is actually love, not commandments. Why? Because if you keep reading, it gets more interesting. Look, it says, given all that, therefore you shall what? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Furthermore, love your neighbor as yourself. So what is this saying? Therefore you shall love. It's saying, in light of all these commandments, it's going to be impossible to hit this. So therefore, what should you do? You should love. It's really the fuel or motivation behind all of it, okay? It's not about keeping the commandments. It's about the engine underneath it, okay? See, the biblical doctrine of being made right with God is not do the right things, then God will love you. No. In fact, it's this. It's if you love God, then you will do the right things. See, it's a rearranging and a sequencing of priorities. It is not obey, therefore, once you obey, I will love you. It's love me, therefore you will obey. Now, you could be thinking, okay, is love just a commandment then? Is that just the right commandment? No. In a sense, yes, but go deeper here. He wants us to love him. He's not commanding us to love him in a sense. He desires that we love him. So what does he want to do? He wants to capture our hearts. He wants our entire self to be captivated by him, and we would throw our heart, mind, soul, and strength entirely in his arms. He wants to capture our attention down to the core of our being. How does he do this? A friend of mine, before I had my first son, he asked me, Blake, what would you die for? And I thought a little bit. I said, my faith. And maybe my wife, my family. And he kind of interrupted me. He said, when you have your son, you will not be thinking that. You will have no pause between what would you die for and the answer. You'll just go, my son. What would you die for? My son. And when he was born, and I laid my eyes on him, I was moved to the point of everything in the core of my being would die for him. There's no duty there. It's a reordering of my affections and my desires. Okay? That's what God is doing to us, okay? It's not, hey, love me, and then you'll do all the right things. It's not even that. It's I will love you. I will throw myself into your arms. How does he do this? Well, in the person of Jesus. He has given himself wholly and entirely for us. How does he do this? Well, on the cross. See, on the cross, Jesus, in his entire ministry in his life, he kept the law perfectly. All of the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and etc., he lived a perfect life and kept that law and pleased God by his duty and his sacrifice to himself. He loved the Lord, his God, the Father, and loved his neighbor as himself. So much so where he was pinned to a tree on the cross. He fulfilled love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself perfectly. Yet he didn't get the reward. He got the curse. He kept the law perfectly and loved his Father perfectly and submitted his life to him and loved his neighbor. When he was on the cross, he said, "Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing." And instead of getting the love and embrace of his Father, he got his wrath. If you see that, your affections and desires will change. It'll alter. It'll move. If you let that sink into your heart, that will capture you. You will see that he threw his son to you, and he was destroyed, so that your affections might be changed and altered, and you might look at him and go, "I love him. Therefore, he's given himself wholly and entirely for me. I will give myself wholly and entirely for him." And that goes back to what the scribe says. What's the first of all the commandments? That you may love God and love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, the Lord Jesus says this for you. He says, you are not far from the kingdom of God. May that be a gateway into the message of Jesus, a gateway into Christianity. I'll see you in the next one.